Hello everybody, Professor G back here with you again. Today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation being one of the big intellectual shifts in modern Europe that's going to set the stage for a lot of other world events especially as far as intellectual history goes, but also other aspects of history as well, because there's a lot of important inventions, there's a lot of important political aspects that come out of the Protestant Reformation that are going to affect not just intellectual history, but also political history and technological history as well. But before we talk about the Reformation, what I want to do is I want to give you a brief background or sort of build up to the Reformation, provide you some historical context, so that way you can understand why exactly this is happening. Okay, so there are 4 points I want to touch on. First is the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a series of conflicts that took place between Great Britain. Again, if you want to pull up a map of Europe, this will probably be really helpful as I'm talking about this, just so you can picture it in your head. The 100 Years' War is a series of conflicts that take place between Britain and France. The 100 Years' War is important for several reasons. First of all, it's going to lead to an increased sense of nationalism and a sense of nationalistic pride, right? I'm British, you're French. Since I'm British, I hate you. Also like patriotism, fighting for king and queen, this sort of thing. The 100 Years' War is also going to lead to the development of standing armies in Europe, people who are paid constantly to fight, professionally trained soldiers, in much the same way as we have a standing army today, our United States military. Okay, this is what we mean by a professional army. And the 100 Years' War is also going to shape the map of Europe. So one of the important things at this time is that so when we think of the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church is still around today, but the Catholic Church in the medieval world, the Catholic Church at this time in the 14th and 15th century, the Catholic Church is not just a religious institution, but it's also a political institution. The Church owns land. The Church is deeply involved in politics. The Church crowns the kings and the queens of Europe, and the kings and the queens of Europe likewise are supposed to pledge their allegiance to the Church. So again, when we talk about the Catholic Church, don't just think religion, but also think politics. Now, the Catholic Church is centered in Rome, which is in Italy, modern-day Italy, if you have your map up. So the 100 Years' War is a battle between France and Britain, both of whom were Catholic at this time, and so it leads to the development of national identity. And this is going to be important later on when we get to Luther. Okay, the second event which happens is the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. Bubonic plague was a disease that spread very rapidly throughout Europe. And the reason why this is an important event is because the plague wipes out about 1/3 of the European population, about 1/3 of the population of Europe. And the plague, it's called the Black Plague because as far as we know, it originates from somewhere along the Black Sea. The plague spreads, is brought first to Italy, and quickly within a few years spreads to all of the major cities in Europe. Italy, it spreads to Italy, to Rome, to Venice, to Paris and France, to London and England. And the plague has a tremendous psychological impact on the European mind. They had no concept of disease, there's no germ theory. Modern medicine, as we know it, doesn't really develop until the 19th century. Okay, so no modern medicine, no real way of treatment. So as far as they know, the plague takes on this religious connotation. The plague is sent by God to punish people. But even that context in which they can interpret it didn't quite make sense, because the plague is an indiscriminate killer. It kills the good as well as the bad. It kills children who were completely innocent as well as older people who have lived their lives. Okay, so it's sort of like this indiscriminate killing. They don't quite understand how it's happening, and they especially don't understand why it's happening. And it kills, again, 1/3 of the population. That's a huge, huge number. So they can't quite wrap their minds around this, of why this is occurring, why God would let this happen. Okay, so 100 Years' War, Black Plague. Let's talk about the Papal Schism. The Pope, who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. Again, there are two groups of Catholics at this time, just as there are two groups of Catholics today. You have Roman Catholics, who are under the tutelage of the Pope of Rome, Roman Catholic Church. And then you have the Orthodox Church, sometimes called the just Orthodox Church in general, the Greek Orthodox Church, which is centered in Byzantium back then, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. It's gone through several different names. So they're under two different, so when I say the Catholic Church, I'm speaking generally here. Throughout this lecture, when I say Catholic Church, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is, the head of the church is the Pope. Now, the great papal schisms of the 13th and 14th century, I said before that the Catholic Church was political, the offices within the church, right, the office of priest or bishop, right, these also took on political roles. And including the office of Pope, because the Pope has a lot of power, not just religious power, but he also carries political power. So a lot of the kings and queens in Europe were looking to get their own members, their own citizens elected to the office of Pope. And so what you have with the Papal Schism is you have different people who are claiming to be Pope. There's a Frenchman who claims to be Pope who moves the Vatican is where the Pope resides, who moves the Vatican and the Council to France. And so then you have an Italian who comes up and says, wait a minute, you can't do that. I'm the true Pope, you're the false Pope. So this is the Great Papal Schism. And as you can imagine, this also affects the European psyche. Okay, because the Pope is supposed to be the religious figurehead of the church. He's supposed to be the head honcho. He's supposed to have some sort of special line, some sort of special communication with God. And what this shows the people is it shows the people how political the role of Pope has become. That it's not just a religious institution, that it has political ramifications, and that people want to be Pope not because they're religious, but because they have political aspirations. Okay, so the Black Death, the Papal Schism, and then we have the Renaissance. The Renaissance begins in Italy. It quickly spreads throughout the rest of Europe. The Renaissance, as far as this context goes, the Renaissance has a big intellectual impact. And the Renaissance is influenced by a type of thought called humanism. Humanism is essentially the study of humanity and approaching history, approaching the arts, approaching theology, all from the human perspective. Now, one of the practical implications of humanism is that you have an emphasis on one of the things that makes us as human beings unique, and that is our language. So an emphasis on language. And what humanists do is that they seek to understand ancient text, ancient writings in the original language. So you have a humanist who views, for example, Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, or the writings of Plato, the writings of Aristotle, and they want to understand these in their original context, so they learn ancient Greek and they read these texts in the original language. So you have a rediscovery of the ancient philosophers, but theologians also quickly adopt this humanistic perspective. And so what this leads to is that theologians want to understand the biblical text in its original language. So you have these theologians going back and reading the original Hebrew and the original Greek. Okay? The Bible as we know it, both the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and the New Testament, was originally translated into Latin in the 4th century by St. Jerome and created what we today know as the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate is the is Jerome's Latin interpretation of both the Greek and Hebrew text. So people, they had the Vulgate. What they wanted to go back and do was read the Bible in the original context before the Vulgate. And what they found was interesting. What they found was that Jerome made a lot of interpretive leaps. He interpreted the Bible that some of the words didn't have an exact meaning, and so Jerome took liberty with these. So you have this humanistic movement, all of these set the stage for the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, generally speaking, is a break away. Not only a religious break, okay, not only do we have a new sect of Christianity emerging, but the Protestant Reformation is also a political break. Because remember, the Catholic Church at this time is not just religious, but it's political. So the Protestant Reformation is a political and a religious split from the Catholic Church. Now, these are some of the main figures of the Reformation. First of all, you have Martin Luther, who's traditionally considered to be the father of the Protestant Reformation. Luther is a German monk, and what sets Luther off, as you may or may not have heard, is the selling of indulgences. There's a gentleman named John Tinsel who was hired by the church to go around. At the time in the 15th century, the current Pope of Rome wanted to build a new cathedral, the Basilica of St. Peter. He had plans for this massive church, but he needed a way to fund it. And so in order to fund it, he started the sale of indulgences. Now, within the Catholic Church at this time, there was a belief in purgatory. So you have, traditionally speaking, most of you are probably familiar with the concepts of heaven and hell, right? Heaven is where you go if you've been saved. Heaven is where you go if you're a good person. Hell is where you go if you're a bad person, right? You probably get this basic concept. Purgatory is sort of the space in between, right? Most of us, we're pretty good people, but we tend to do some pretty bad things throughout our life. Purgatory is a place where you're destined for heaven, but you need to be cleansed. You're not fit to go straight to heaven, right? Because you're still kind of a bad person. So purgatory is that intermediate position. But purgatory isn't really a fun place. You're still, you're still tortured, right? You're still going through that cleansing process, and this is not a fun, feel-good process. This is quite painful as it's described. So they're selling these indulgences, and what an indulgence does is that it releases either you or one of your family members who have passed. It releases them from purgatory earlier. So let's say your Aunt Martha was a pretty good lady, but she had a tendency to hit the bottle a little too hard, right? She was a drunk. So she goes away, and you know that drunks don't go straight to heaven. They have to spend some time in purgatory, sobering up a bit. So you want to make sure that your Aunt Martha, let's say, I'm just going to throw out some arbitrary numbers here. Your Aunt Martha has 600 years in purgatory because of her alcohol abuse. And you say, well, that's a bit too harsh. I want to do something for my Aunt Martha, so I'm going to buy an indulgence. And I buy an indulgence, and I reduce her sentence by 100 years because I give, let's say, 100 gold pieces. And this is how indulgences work. You give money, and the money you give, the Pope will pray on your behalf, because the Pope has a special connection with God. He'll pray on your behalf, or some monks will, or some nuns will, and they'll reduce the sentence of your loved one, or yourself, you can buy one for yourself as well, from purgatory. Now, this really, really upset Luther, who at the time was a professor. He was teaching, he's a theology professor at the University of Wittenberg. John Tinsel, the guy who is selling the indulgences, comes through his town. He starts preaching. He starts selling them. The information of this comes to Luther. Luther gets upset with it, so he decides to do something about it, and he writes his bishop. And the writing of his bishop is today what we refer to as the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses, in which Luther basically says the selling of indulgences is wrong. it's impious, in fact it may be sinful, and that if the Pope wants to build the Cathedral of Peter, the Basilica of St. Peter, then the Pope needs to fund it himself. And he needs to stop relying upon and stop manipulating the hopes and the fears of these peasants in order to fund his own building project. Now, of course, this gets Luther into some hot water. Luther is put on trial for impiety at the Diet of Worms. Luther is told to recant his position. Luther, by the time of the Diet of Worms, he's pretty outspoken against the Pope. He's told to recant. Luther doesn't. He's sentenced to jail and possibly to be executed. But on his way from the Diet of Worms, Worms is a small place, small town. On his way from Worms to his holding cell, Luther is rescued by his Prince Frederick. Now, this is important for several reasons. One is because after Luther is rescued, he proceeds to his attack on Rome, his attack on the Pope. He does this by not appealing to theologians, but appealing to the common people. So Luther is the first person to translate the Bible in the vernacular, in the common tongue. So he translates the Bible into German, the language of the people, because Luther is German. His prince is backing Luther, but it's not just religious backing. His prince breaks away from the Holy Roman Empire. His prince says, I'm now following Luther. I don't owe anything to the Pope. I don't have to give any tribute to the Pope. We are now our own kingdom, our own principality. So again, the Protestant Reformation is not just a religious break, and doesn't just have religious significance, but there's also political significance. John Calvin is also an important reformer. Calvin is operating out of Switzerland, the city of Geneva. Calvin, like Luther, is going to break away from the Catholic Church. Luther and Calvin have some theological differences, and I'll talk about Luther's theology a bit in the next video to help prepare you for your reading. But Calvin, I bring up Calvin because you also see this political and religious aspect. Calvin theologically disagrees with Catholic doctrine, but Calvin is also in the city of Geneva creating his own government, a theocracy in fact. So again, he's breaking away not just from Catholic religious tradition, but also from the political rule of the Catholic Church. Now let me talk about what is perhaps the most important technological invention, not only in the Reformation, but probably throughout world history, and that is the printing press. The printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg. And so before the printing press, we kind of take this stuff for granted because it's so common to us. Before the printing press, books had to be handwritten by monks, typically speaking. Most people weren't literate, most people didn't know how to read and write, and so you had a scribal class of people. Classes in like a social class, whose full-time job it was to copy manuscripts, to write out manuscripts, whether it was orders from the king or whether it was copying ancient text. So Gutenberg invents the mobile type. So what would happen is, not the mobile type, he invents the printing press. You would have a plate, and the plate would have a couple of paragraphs on it. You would dip that plate in ink, lift up the plate, and stamp it down on a piece of paper. It's a very long and tedious process by our standards, but it dramatically reduces the time that it takes to print and to copy books. Books were printed at a much higher rate after the invention of the printing press than at any time in history. And this leads to several things. It leads to an increase in literacy, but it also aids Luther in his attempt to break away from the Catholic Church. Because Luther uses this not just to copy old books, but Luther is also a master propagandist. So Luther prints out tracts derailing the Pope, railing against the Pope. He makes political cartoons. He's one of the first to do this. And he makes tracts that would appeal to the common person. That the common person, even though they couldn't read, they could find somebody who could read it, or maybe a funny drawing of the Pope that they wouldn't have to read, they could just look at it. So the printing press, not only does it increase literacy, and not only does it make the possibility of knowledge to spread more quickly through the printing of books, but we also get political propaganda, something that we are all very used to in the current day media. So with the printing press is the spread of knowledge. It is now easier and quicker to record things, to record business transactions, to record ancient text, but you also get the beginning of newspapers describing current events and putting their own spin on these current events. Okay, so that's it for the Protestant Reformation. Tune in for the next video and we'll talk about the actual theology, the actual content of what Luther had to say. See you later, folks.